How then can you have confidence in your Prime Minister that he is acting in the interests of the United Kingdom? This is as serious as it gets. A definitively two-tier system. This is an anti-British Prime Minister. So Keir Starmer has decided to save his own skin from a rebellion in his proposed reform to welfare payments, but in doing so, in my view, definitively creating a two-tier benefit system. I'll explain why I think that in this video and why he might not be out of the woods yet. And also, apparently they're planning to ban adverts on alcohol. Not that I drink alcohol anymore, but more about that a little bit later in the video. So what are we talking about here? Well, you probably haven't escaped the news that 120 Labour MPs were set to rebel and vote against Keir Starmer in these reforms in a vote set to happen on Tuesday. Keir Starmer, realising that he's going to face a huge and embarrassing defeat, has backtracked, caved in to the demands of these rebels by agreeing that existing disability claimants can keep their benefits, specifically with regard to personal independence payments, so that nobody who currently receives it will lose out. But what that then means is that these changes for who is eligible to receive this money, given to help people with the extra costs of disabilities, day-to-day life and so on, will only apply to new claimants. In other words, the befores and the afters, a definitively two-tier system. If you have the identical systematic difficulties now as somebody who before these changes come into effect, you will not receive the payments, but the previous person will. These changes are set to cost the Treasury around £1.5 billion a year by the end of the decade, which brings the original savings down by roughly a third. That figure sounds vaguely familiar from the VAT discussions we had on school fees, because by some quirk of coincidence, they also planned, optimistically in my view, to generate £1.5 billion from VAT on private school fees. I don't think that's realistic, but again, I've discussed that plenty in other videos. But this is obviously going to put more pressure on Rachel Reeves, as quite rightly pointed out by The Telegraph here. She's going to need to find another £1.5 billion in the autumn budget. So what does this mean? Well, you can look forward to further tax increases in various aspects of life, because they can't, as they keep telling us, magic this money out of thin air. So in order for Keir Starmer to back down on these changes, they have to find £1.5 billion a year. So what is the worst that could happen for Keir Starmer, and why is he not out of the woods yet? Taking those in turn, if a Prime Minister suffers a huge rebellion and defeat in Parliament in the House of Commons, he might then also face a vote of no confidence, because if a significant chunk of his own party vote against him, that obviously doesn't look good. By definition, they don't have confidence in what he's pushing through. This is very different to one of the very controversial bills that was pushed through not long ago, where they were given a free vote, whereby many of them may vote against what the Prime Minister suggests. But in this case, if it is a party line, something they really want to push through, and I understand 127 Labour MPs were backing an amendment to kill this legislation, that doesn't look good for the Prime Minister. And therefore that might trigger, at or around the same time, a vote of no confidence, in which case that's one way that the Prime Minister can be removed from office. Now, he's not necessarily out of the woods, because just because he's backed down on this doesn't necessarily mean that some of the more hardline MPs will still hold out their vote against the government's wishes, against Keir Starmer's wishes, and again kill the legislation anyway. And again, that could potentially trigger a vote of no confidence. And thus we end up with some really damaging headlines such as this one here. I'll link these articles below. By Cheryl Jacobs, with this surrender to the leftist rebels, Starmer's days as PM are numbered. It is now clear that Starmer is making major concessions to his belligerent MPs to save his political career. A series of compromises have drastically diluted the landmark welfare bill. This is not just a personal defeat. Starmerism, the fine line of defence between the far left and the levers of power, is on the brink of collapse, she writes. Rachel Reeves and her Treasury colleagues will conclude Britain has little choice but to continue pursuing mass migration and increasing taxation. But now we're also facing some other suggestions that some of you might think are ridiculous. You might agree with them, I don't know, let me know in the comments. But now we face headlines like this. Now nanny state Labour gets set to call time on TV alcohol adverts. It appears from draft documents according to the Daily Mail that they are literally planning to ban adverts for alcohol and limit opening hours for shops and introducing a minimum unit pricing. Now, it depends on how you look at this. If you look at alcohol as something that you really should cut down and you really should get healthier and you're planning to give up alcohol, as I did about 2 years ago now, believe it or not, I gave up alcohol. And as it happens, I have a really interesting story to tell you about that. So having given up alcohol for 2 years now and coming into the summer, and if like me, you're going to keep training, you really do need to stay hydrated. That is where a fantastic part of my channel comes in, Holy, who produce hydration drinks, iced teas, and energy drinks, but not full of all the usual junk and sugars that you might find in some of them. In fact, there is zero sugar, they're all natural flavors, and they're full of vitamins and antioxidants. I still prefer the strawberry and kiwi flavor, even though they do a whole range of fantastic flavors, including some brand new ones. They're bringing them out all the time. As well as milkshakes and the iced teas, the range is just phenomenal. You fill up a bottle, you put 1 spoon of powder in there, you give it a shake, and you get a delicious drink which, as I mentioned, is full of vitamins and antioxidants with zero sugar, unlike a lot of the drinks that you'll find out there. The newest flavors include pineapple and coconut, lime and mint, and strawberry and lime. But if you don't know what to go for, you don't know what flavor you might like, I'd suggest going with the Starter Set Deluxe, which has 42 servings of a range of different flavors. Plus, you get a nice one of these to go with it as well. And as you might expect, you get a discount with my codes. Just use the code Barrister5 for a straightforward £5 discount off your order. Or if you want 10% off, just go with a straight code Barrister. That might do for a larger order or an ongoing order. So keep yourself hydrated this summer. Check out Holy. They are fantastic drinks. I have one with me all the time, and you'll love them this summer. So thanks to Holy, and do check them out. But now back to something really interesting, because it appears that Robert Jenrick is calling out Keir Starmer as being a little bit of a hypocrite. Remember the break into the RAF base for which Palestine Action claimed responsibility? Choosing my words carefully there. Well, despite Keir Starmer condemning this as a disgraceful raid on a UK airbase, it now appears that he defended RAF protesters in court. Now, that by itself is not a problem, necessarily, because we are subject to the cab rank rule. But as Kemi Badenoch put it, it's nothing to do with the cab rank rule, and it appears for reasons that I'll explain just now. But first, the cab rank rule and what it means. Now, if as a barrister we get an instruction from a professional, now that includes a solicitor or a company that is licensed to instruct, but that's really complicated, so I'll explain that later. If we get an instruction from a solicitor and we are available, the fee is a proper fee and the work is within our level of competency and we are not prohibited from doing it for any reasons of conflict of interest or anything of that nature, then we must do the case on what we call the cab rank rule. And it comes from that phrase. If you picture a line of cabs lining up, they must take whichever passenger comes to the front of the queue, without any kind of discrimination whatsoever. Now, we are under a general duty not to discriminate against anybody, but the cab rank rule is special. We must take that case if we're available to do it, unless, of course, as I say, there's a conflict or something of that nature. But that doesn't apply if you are doing work pro bono, which is what appears to be the case here. Because Robert Jenrick now claims that while Starmer claims that he had no choice to represent a woman arrested over 500 times breaking into an RAF base, that's not necessarily true. Robert Jenrick claims that she said he had volunteered to do this for free. The cab rank rule and the exceptions to it are set out at C29 and 30 of our handbook, which contains what used to be called the Code of Conduct. RC29 is the cab rank rule. RC30 says that the cab rank rule of C29 does not apply, and if you look down to the second page here, point 8, one of the exceptions to the cab rank rule is where the barrister has not been offered a proper fee for services. And this even applies to situations such as a conditional fee agreement or damage-based agreement. Those briefly are conditional fee, you only pay if you win, or if you've been offered a damage-based agreement such that you carry out the instructions and you are entitled as the barrister to a percentage of damages at the end of it. On that basis, the barrister may refuse instructions on the basis that the fee is not proper if the fee is structured in one of those ways. Now, of course, we still may not discriminate against anybody, but that is not what Robert Jenrick says happened here. He says that Keir Starmer did this for free. Take a listen to this.
In 2001, Starmer volunteered for free to represent a woman who'd broken into US and UK air bases 500 times, presumably because he had sympathy with her anti-British anti-Western political views. And this week, Downing Street lied. They said he'd been forced to take on the case because of the so-called cab rank rule. But look, that is not true. The cab rank rule doesn't apply when you take on cases pro bono as a volunteer. So Starmer needs to apologise for their lies and set the record straight. Oh, and one last thing. It's a good job he failed in that case back then, or else Palestine Action, who broke into an airbase this week, would have had a legal precedent, a defence against their despicable action against our armed forces and our military bases.
And so Robert Jenrick has written to Keir Starmer demanding that he correct this record and says as follows: in 2001, you chose to defend Lindis Percy, a serial trespasser arrested more than 500 times for breaking into the RAF and US air bases to disrupt and sabotage military aircraft. You volunteered your time pro bono to argue that such attacks could be lawful, presumably because you had sympathy with her actions. The cab rank rule, he says, cannot excuse that choice. And for reasons I've just explained, that's right. We are not forced by the cab rank rule to take on a case pro bono. That just wouldn't make sense. We cannot be forced to take on a case for free. I hope that's common sense. He goes on, whereas here no fee is offered, RC 30.8, the bit that I've just showed you, of the Bar Standards Board Handbook, removes any duty to act. Downing Street's ludicrous claim that you had no choice owing to the cab rank rule is therefore false. He says you must now correct it and make clear you acted voluntarily. That's important for reasons I'll come back to in a moment. He says by championing Miss Percy and others, you tried to create a precedent that would make a politically motivated sabotage of defence assets immune from punishment. Had you succeeded, last week's raid on RAF base Brize Norton would today be on firm legal ground. He says you then celebrated risking national security by featuring Miss Percy in your 2020 leadership launch video. Once a lawyer selects a client for political promotion, that clearly becomes an endorsement of them and their actions. The public is entitled to interpret your views as anti-British and a threat to our national security. Our armed forces deserve a Prime Minister who has their back, not one who spent a career defending and then lauding those who attacked them. Now, you may well think that this is an anti-British Prime Minister based on what Robert Jenrick says here. Because if indeed, as it appears the case from Robert Jenrick, Keir Starmer acted pro bono for free to defend this lady who was arrested more than 500 times breaking into RAF and US air bases to disrupt and sabotage military aircraft, how then can you have confidence in your Prime Minister that he is acting in the interests of the United Kingdom and its military bases? Now, this is as serious as it gets, folks. Not only is he facing rebellion from his own party for welfare cuts and all of these kind of things, and disrupting all areas across the country, from farmers to private school children at schools that have been teaching for hundreds of years that are now closing down. Not only all those things apply, but now he also stands accused of misleading Parliament for saying that he was forced to take on this case when, if it turns out that he acted pro bono, that is simply not true, because the Bar Standards Board Handbook makes it absolutely clear that we are not obliged by the cab rank rule if we've not been offered a proper fee for services. That would simply not make any sense whatsoever. So let me know what you think about that in the comments below. Please do like the video and subscribe. Check out Holy, they are fantastic. And as always, thank you for watching.